What's up, heathens? How you doing? Today we're going over some more resurrection proof, which we've managed to find a video that encompasses a lot of different arguments in such a short time span. We're going to try to get through them all and just do a quick refutation of everything that's contained in this video. Here's the video that we're talking about today.
Gary Habermas, law-trained journalist Lee Strobel said when he said cold case detective J. Warner Wallace, "I leave thee with this." From Clive Staples Lewis. My one and only line of evidence has to do with the appearances of Jesus after his death.
Yes, so we're going to be debunking all of this stuff today. So if you're interested in how Jesus didn't actually rise from the dead and how little historical evidence we actually have for it, then please stay tuned. If you're interested in the history of early Christianity, then consider downloading the Crestus app, available on Google Play and the App Store. Crestus uses peer-reviewed sources to give you the most up-to-date scholarship on historical claims for and against Jesus. Download today to find out why the historical sources for Jesus Christ don't support his existence.
Now, lots of people say that there's no evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Okay, sorry to stop this so quick. I do hear that a lot of people saying that there's no evidence for the resurrection. While technically I still feel that that's true, that there's no evidence to support the idea that Jesus was resurrected, I do agree that Christians think they have evidence to support that, the idea that Jesus resurrected. So it's not that they don't have any evidence for it, it's that they don't have any good evidence that supports their actual conclusion.
So all I'm going to do here is provide one line of evidence. It's unfortunate, but I just don't have the time to mention something like the half-dozen facts developed by resurrection expert Gary Habermas, for instance. Minimal facts that even skeptics, atheists, and liberal scholars agree on.
Okay, so this whole "I don't have time to explain this" is going to be kind of a running theme as he's trying to go fast, but yet he still explains it himself. I don't know what the purpose of that is. Maybe it's just to mention that you can easily disseminate these facts to people. Maybe that's the point of it. I'm not sure. Gary Habermas is an apologist that has done a lot of research into the historical Jesus subject area. I have responded to all of his minimal facts before on the channel. I even have a playlist where I'm directly responding to Gary Habermas, but I don't feel like I explained very well in those early videos like why Gary is wrong. So we're going to be going through his 6 minimal facts here right up front, and I want to provide you with good information about why his facts either aren't actual facts or don't support his conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead.
These facts are as follows. 1, that Jesus died by crucifixion.
Oh, okay. Hold on. He's going a little fast here. Okay. So first off, there is no good evidence that Jesus was actually crucified. Paul was our first indication of a Jesus Christ in history, at least the historical one that's claimed by the Gospels and the Bible in general. Paul never actually places Jesus on earth. Every time he talks about Jesus, it's a celestial Jesus that he's talking about. So when he talks about Christ being, killed by crucifixion, dying and then resurrecting, he makes sure that he specifies this by saying that he got this from Jesus Christ himself. Because the only way for Paul to actually get any of this information is directly by Jesus. He can't rely on any, testimony by a person or anything like that. So any information that Paul has, he got from his hallucination of the celestial Jesus.
And 2, that very soon afterwards, his followers had real experiences that they thought were actual appearances of the risen Jesus.
Okay, so before we get to number 3, there's a little bit of nuance in this number 2, because even if we accept the idea that the disciples were actually a thing and they actually experienced Jesus or whatnot, this is just the mere belief that he resurrected, not any kind of actual historical proof that he actually did resurrect. But there's good reason to think that the disciples weren't even actually a thing. For one thing, like we referenced before, Paul got all of his information from a celestial Jesus. Paul never mentions disciples. He never uses that word or any word that could be confused with disciple. The only kind of apologists that Paul talks about are apostles. Those are people that have witnessed the risen Jesus or hallucinated a celestial Jesus. Those are the only people that exist in Paul's time. So no disciples would be in existence at that point in time. And the only way that you can get information about this Jesus character is through hallucinations that they considered to be celestial. So this second fact isn't so much a fact, more so than just an element of the Gospels. That's where the disciples first pop up.
3, that their lives were transformed as a result, even to the point of being willing to die specifically for their faith in the resurrection message.
So this particular fact is just an element of the Gospels as well, including Acts, because Acts is where we get where the disciples died. The fact is that the disciples being moved by faith or moved by the risen Christ to be able to die for their faith in Jesus, all of that only comes from the Gospels, and it's very important to consider this because the Gospels were written at least 40 years after Jesus supposedly died. So with the Gospels being written that long after, and the first Gospel, Mark, being the only one that could be somewhat considered independent, even though it was most likely derived from either Paul or the community that Paul was in, Mark doesn't even record the deaths of the disciples. Mark originally ends with the women running away from the tomb and not telling anyone, which calls into question as to how Mark even became written. All in all, though, this particular fact is based on these fictional gospels that were written 40 years after Jesus supposedly died that record events that not even Paul himself says happened. Because Paul never mentions an earthly ministry of Jesus. He never mentions anyone that saw Jesus here on earth, and he stresses that he got his information from no person, but only the celestial Jesus.
4, that these things were taught very early, soon after the crucifixion.
Well, first of all, you got to solidify when the crucifixion happened, because even if you look at the Gospels, they're a little confused as to when it happened. Second, it doesn't matter when these particular beliefs first sprang up. Just because somebody believes something doesn't make that historical fact.
5, that James, Jesus' unbelieving brother, became a Christian due to his own experience that he thought was the resurrected Christ.
So, this particular point is very nuanced, and you have to go back to the original Greek that Paul was writing in. This comes from Galatians 1:19, where Paul supposedly talks about James, the brother of the Lord. Now, the problem with this particular passage is that the actual word used by Paul is adelphos, and that word in Greek either means a blood brother or a religious kinsman. So, without some kind of clarifying phrase as to what kind of brother of the Lord this person was, you can't actually tell what Paul was meaning here. But you can look at Paul's theology to see what he possibly could have meant. Because part of Paul's theology was that as soon as you were baptized into the Christian faith, you became part of the family of God and therefore a brother of the Lord, or sister of the Lord if you were a woman. So most likely what Paul was meaning here is that this is just another Christian, not that it was the literal blood brother of Jesus Christ. Now, like I said, this particular point is nuanced. It's highly contested by apologists and people that eat up apologist bullshit. But the fact remains that the theology of Paul doesn't allow for brother of the Lord to be strictly taken as being a blood brother. So this particular fact, while they think it's a fact, isn't actually a fact.
And 6, that the Christian persecutor Paul, formerly Saul of Tarsus, also became a believer after a similar experience.
Okay. I don't understand why this particular fact, is somehow supporting the Christian position. I know that this is just the minimal facts that Gary Habermas is presenting here about Jesus, and there's no actual claim being made using these facts, but considering that it's a video supporting the historical evidence for the resurrection, I can only imagine that the person that's producing this video is bringing it up to support the idea that Paul, turning from persecutor of Christians to a Christian himself, is somehow evidence of a risen Jesus. And this particular argument is made all the time by apologists. But just because one Jew in the first century decided that Jesus had risen from the dead and was the Messiah and all of that, doesn't mean that that's actually historical, especially when you consider the fact that Paul wrote a lot of stuff, and in that stuff he says that he did not see a physical Jesus, he only saw a celestial Jesus. And nobody else that was around him had seen like an earthly Jesus. The only way anybody could get information about Jesus in Paul's time was to get a hallucination of Jesus, which they called revelation, or by reading the scriptures, and we'll get into that here in a little bit.
Man, I wish I had the time to mention those, but I just don't. No time, good sir. No time at all.
I could really do without this entire part.
I just don't have time to bring up what former atheist and law-trained journalist Lee Strobel said when he said, "I figured it would be easy to disprove the resurrection. Give me a weekend and I can shred Christianity's central claim." Well, it wasn't that easy. After investigating the historical evidence, Mr. Strobel believed in the resurrection of Jesus. Watch the movie, read the books. Bummer I couldn't mention that to you.
Okay. This doesn't actually support your position of Jesus resurrecting. You're sort of bringing this up as if it's proof that just because some people are convinced by the horrible historical research that they can do doesn't mean that it is actually a historical event. And just because they switch from atheist to Christian is not like some kind of evidence that attests to the resurrection of Jesus. We would need actual historical proof, not an appeal to authority.
Ain't got time for this quote either. "My job is to infer what is most reasonable from the list of evidences," said cold case detective J. Warner Wallace.
Oh, okay. Well, evidence isn't a word. So J. Warner Wallace was an investigative detective who did cold cases, and he tried to apply his training in cold case detective work to the historical evidence for Jesus. And of course, he started out as an atheist and he turned into a Christian when he started investigating the historical evidence for Jesus. Now, if this doesn't sound familiar, it's the pretty much exact same story as Lee Strobel that he just mentioned. So Lee Strobel first did it, and then J. Warner Wallace copied him or something. I'm not saying that he definitely copied him. I'm just saying that it's kind of strange that both of them did it, and then they both became Christian, and then they both made careers off of that transition. Just saying, seems a little fishy.
After digging into the evidence, I was convinced that what the Bible claims about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation. The only weakness in the case, and there are always weaknesses, was my own bias against resurrections.
Well, I wonder, could that bias against resurrections be that no resurrections have ever fucking occurred in history? Probably. Because that would put the prior probability of some Jew in the first century resurrecting to be so close to zero that you could disregard it. Now, he's bringing up these people as an appeal to authority, saying that, oh, these people investigated the historical evidence, they became Christian. So, therefore, you should become Christian, or at least you should believe the resurrection of Jesus because these people were convinced. That is not a good argument for believing in a particular deity. All that is an appeal to authority, and I'm just not convinced by appeals to authority.
Now, since I don't have time to mention such things, let me just get right to my point, okay?
Why even bother putting all of these in if you're just going to bitch and complain the entire time about not having time? You realize this is YouTube, right? People do an hour-long seminar on these particular bits of evidence. I mean, like you said before, Lee Strobel has a whole movie and a few books dedicated to this. You got time, bud. But yes, please, after a minute 40 of you saying you don't have time, let's finally have some time to get to your point.
My one and only line of evidence has to do with the appearances of Jesus after his death. This is recorded in an early creed cited by the aforementioned Paul the Apostle, which we find in his letter to the Corinthian church. "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared also to me."
Okay, so this is the Pauline Creed, basically, but he's reading from a specific version of the Bible that says what he wants it to say. All right, I want you to pay attention to the fact that it says, in accordance with the Scriptures. This is to lead you on to think that Jesus somehow fulfilled prophecy because he actually came to earth, died, resurrected. He wants it to seem like Jesus was doing this actually on earth, but it was prophesied. So there's that. But if you'll notice here, like we did before, going back to the original Greek that Paul wrote in, you will see that it says according to the scriptures, not in accordance with the scriptures. So this creed that Paul is reciting here says that the prophecies were being fulfilled, not that Jesus fulfilled the prophecies. And the only way that Paul could have gotten this information, or at least been certain of this information, is when he was told about it by Jesus through revelation or reading it in the scriptures, like he seems to indicate here. What Paul is saying is that he didn't actually see these things, but he read it in the scriptures that these things were supposed to happen. That's all this creed is saying, and to present it in a way that makes it sound like Jesus was just fulfilling prophecies is very disingenuous.
Okay, there's a lot of people who saw Jesus after he was crucified and buried, and this is exactly why Paul was so confident to stand in front of Festus and King Agrippa and tell them the truth. It's in Acts 25 and 26. Here's a snippet. Paul says, "I stand here testifying, saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses said would come to pass, that the Christ must suffer, and that, by being the first to rise from the dead, he would proclaim light both to our people and to the Gentiles."
I don't know why you think this helps your position, because Paul is imparting on these people that he is reciting nothing else other than what the prophets and Moses said would come to pass. So basically, he's just reciting prophecies about this supposed Messiah. Not that this supposed Messiah actually came and did these things, just that the prophets said it would happen, and they somehow came up with a time when it was supposed to happen, and so now they have started having revelations and all this other stuff, hallucinations about Jesus, imparting on to them what happened. And so that's all Paul's doing, is just telling him about the prophecies and what this hallucinatory Jesus actually told him. And that's all Paul is telling these people.
Now Festus said with a loud voice, "Paul, your great learning is driving you out of your mind." Not sure if that was his actual accent, but Paul said, "I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus. I am speaking true and rational words."
Well, Paul was speaking true words because that's what the prophecies said, and nothing that Paul said was against what the prophecies would have said. So, yeah, he was speaking truth from the theology, but not truth about history. Also, Festus would definitely have a southern accent. Like, I don't care where you are in the world, Festus would definitely sound like this. "Whoo, Paul, with your great fucking knowledge, you're going out of your mind, buddy."
For the king knows about these things. None of these things has escaped his notice, for this has not been done in a corner. In other words, all this was falsifiable. Everyone around town was talking about Jesus' resurrection.
Kind of curious how you say that, yet nobody actually records this other than Paul. And even Paul doesn't cite the Romans as crucifying Jesus. Paul actually uses the word archons, which at this point in time, archons were used to denote like the demons that ruled the world. So it seems to me like the rulers of this world or whatnot, being Satan and his demons, would have been the ones crucifying Jesus, according to Paul.
People had seen him. The tomb was empty. The stone was rolled away. The guards were perplexed. The religious leaders were mystified and tried to create a lie about what happened to the body.
Weirdly enough, Paul knew nothing about those particular things. He knew nothing about the stone being rolled away, about there being Roman guards, about people making up shit or something about why the body was gone, that particular thing. Paul didn't know about any of that. Paul never states that any of that happened. All of that came from the Gospels, which were written at least 40 years afterwards, and even then, Mark is the only one that you could try to consider independent, and he doesn't even indicate that there were Roman soldiers there, or that anybody was there to roll away the stone, because when the women came upon the tomb, the stone was already rolled away and Jesus was already gone. It's only in later embellishments on Mark that you add the Roman soldiers, or you add an angel descending from above and bitch slapping the stone away. And those particular versions of Mark's gospel cannot be considered independent because they used Mark as the source.
Paul, who was persecuting Christians earlier, was now one of them preaching the resurrection of Christ. None of this was hidden. It was all out in the open.
And still, over 20 people that should have written about Jesus at this time never wrote about him. Kind of curious, don't you think? And I mean, you cite Paul here as being turn from a Christian persecutor to a Christian himself as some kind of evidence that this resurrection actually happened. But that doesn't actually prove anything historical, especially when you consider the fact that Paul never saw Jesus here on earth. So there's no way that Paul can be used as a historical reference to Jesus.
So, my eclectic, evidence-eager evangelist, each ecstatically expecting an extraordinary ending, I leave thee with this, from Clive Staples Lewis. This is the story. What are we to make of Christ? There is no question of what we can make of him. It is entirely a question of what he intends to make of us. You must accept or reject the story.
So I don't really care what C.S. Lewis has to say. This is just another appeal to authority, especially with him saying that you have to just accept it. That's such a Christian thing to say.
But what you can't do is glibly claim or irresponsibly assert that there is no evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, because that, my friends, has been debunked. Adios.
It's not a glib claim or irresponsibly asserting that there is no evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Now, there more specifically is no good evidence to support the idea that Jesus resurrected from the dead, if you wanted to be really specific about the actual position. But colloquially, we say that there is no evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, because none of the evidence actually supports that conclusion. But thank you guys for joining me today. If you have any criticisms of me in this video, of the things that I've said, please leave them down in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. While you're down there, be sure to smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice, and I will see you heathens later.